how can we trust that in the end, when things get difficult and downright nasty, how can we trust that these people will stand up and fight for what's right when many of them are making it so painfully clear that they themselves have no idea what they're actually fighting for? What up? It's Dramos, and this is the recap. Of course, as I do each and every week, breaking down some of the biggest headlines from this last week. Let's get into some of the BS from this last week real quick. Now, politics are an incredibly divisive topic, and in a world where agenda supersedes facts, I personally aim to speak truth and preach what I believe to be morally right on my platforms. And in doing so, I at times had to call out the very people that I've supported. And throughout this process of trying to be as fair as possible, I've recently come to a pretty big realization. And that realization is that Democrats are the F-boys of the political world. And I'll be real here. As a former F-boy myself, I can personally speak to this. And all you women out there watching this, I'm sure you can relate to this on some sort of level, right? Like, I'm sure you've met this guy, right? And at the beginning, you know, he seems great, seems like a great dude, you know, a real catch. He's super attentive. He, he's texting you throughout the day, cute little things, right? And, he even takes you on a date to a super cool, trendy bar. And after several rounds of, tequila shots, you both stumble out of there and you go back to his place where you give him the goods. And after that, he becomes harder to reach than a live person on an automated telephone system. Now, that guy I'm talking about is the very definition of an F-boy. And that's what modern day Democrats are. I mean, they get you all hot and bothered during the elections, right? Making you feel like you've finally found someone who really sees you, right? Only to conveniently become too busy to answer your text after you let them slide on into office. Now, side note here, I joke around about being a former F-boy back in my single days. But if we're being honest here, unlike the Democrats, I was always pretty upfront about my intentions. So it's not my fault that you thought you could fix me or even, just turned out to be flat out crazy. But enough of me defending myself. I digress. Now, as much as it pains me to give the Republicans credit for anything, I gotta hand it to them. I mean, they are very clear on what they stand for. I mean, they want the biggest, strongest guns they can get their hands on in the event of a zombie apocalypse. I mean, they also want to take away the right to vote for anyone who might potentially oppose them. And of course, they want to hold on with dear life to the white supremacist values that this country was built upon. I mean, for example, let's take a look at the comments of a Republican lawmaker out of Tennessee, Justin Lafferty, who this last week publicly defended the 3/5 compromise. Now, this compromise, it agreed that slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a person when it came to the state's population and inevitably a state's representation. I mean, let's hear him defending this.
The 3/5 compromise was a direct effort to ensure that Southern states never got the population necessary to continue the practice of slavery everywhere else in the country.
Yet the 3/5 compromise wasn't about ending slavery at all. It was one of a number of pro-slavery compromises baked into the Constitution. What Representative Lafferty failed to mention is that the compromise meant that a state could count 3/5 of its enslaved population toward its total population, even though enslaved people had no rights and certainly couldn't vote. That gave Southern states more representation and effectively more political power.
As he said, if this was intended to help end slavery, why wasn't slavery abolished for another 90 years after this compromise was signed? I don't know here. But from the year 1787 and the Constitution itself to now in 2021, we're seeing that consistency that I was speaking of, right? As modern day Republicans are making comments like that, defending racist practices, and they even applauded him after those comments were made. Yes, that's right. Those Republicans had an ovation for this man after he made those comments.
Lafferty's speech received a round of applause from some of his colleagues.
But once again, to the credit of the Republicans, they are staying on brand and being unapologetic about it. Now, for the Democrats, in true F-boy fashion, after getting what they wanted, they're leaving those of us who voted for them on red, knowing that when it's time for re-elections, we're going to get that inevitable, "Hey, stranger," text, right? Like, let's take Kamala Harris, who, as Joe Biden's running mate in the election, helped win crucial states like Georgia and Arizona, in large part to their messaging that, was directed at people of color. And as a result, those voters, those people of color, came out in record numbers. Now, for context here, let's flash back to some of Kamala's comments on race and racism in general last year during the Democratic debates when she was trying to become the Democratic nominee for president. Let's take a listen.
On the issue of race, I couldn't agree more that this is an issue that is still not being talked about truthfully and honestly. There is not a black man I know, be he a relative, a friend, or a coworker, who has not been the subject of some form of profiling or discrimination. Growing up, my sister and I had to deal with the neighbor who told us her parents couldn't play with us because we were black.
Okay, good stuff there, right? Acknowledging that racism is a real problem here in America. But now let's flash forward to this year. Just a little over a week ago, as she now as vice president is being asked if she agreed with Tim Scott on his comments about America not being racist.
Senator Tim Scott said last night that America is not a racist country. Do you agree with that? And what do you make of his warning against fighting discrimination with more discrimination?
I believe that we need to address, well, first of all, no, I don't think America is a racist country, but we also do have to speak truth about the history of racism in our country and its existence today.
Wait, so according to 2020, Kamala, you'd be hard-pressed to find a black man in this country who hasn't experienced some form of racism, right? But 2021, Kamala confidently claims that this country isn't racist, while also simultaneously in the same breath trying to walk back that statement by saying that there is a history of racism in this country and it still exists. Now, I may still be a little hungover from Cinco de Mayo, but something here is just not adding up for me, right? I mean, that's like a dude who's been cheating on his girl for the entirety of their relationship, getting mad at her when she calls him a cheater. Like, my dude, facts are facts. You aren't St. Pete. Like, you are what you are, and it is a cheater. And to be fair, it's not just Kamala Harris here, right? Like, if I had more time, I'd dig up old clips of Joe Biden contradicting himself, or Barack Obama calling out unnamed Democrats in his book who bent to pressures from large pharmaceutical companies who resided in their states. But my point here is not to tarnish the name of Vice President Harris, but rather point out that comments like the ones I just showed you, those comments from the second highest ranking Democrat make it painfully obvious that the modern day Democratic Party doesn't actually stand on any real fundamentals, and they're just getting behind whatever rhetoric will be most popular amongst their voters, right? And I'll admit, it's a little bit comforting and maybe even exciting to know that if we make our voices loud enough, we can sway them in some sort of way, right? But that comfort and that excitement is far outweighed by the voice inside my head that reminds me, how can we trust that in the end, when things get difficult and downright nasty, how can we trust that these people will stand up and fight for what's right when many of them are making it so painfully clear that they themselves have no idea what they're actually fighting for? Man, before we get out of here, of course, let's end the show on some positivity. As we always like to do in the form of a positive quote. Now, this week's quote only felt fitting to come from us, from our queen, AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, because as I talk about Democrats who are proving they're not actually fighting for anything they truly believe in, she is one of the exceptions. And her quote, I felt like, is pretty self-explanatory and stands alone for this conversation that I started the show with. Now, her quote is, "Working class Americans want a clear champion. And there is nothing radical about moral clarity." Yes, I couldn't have said that better myself. Moral clarity. We want to know where you stand and that you truly believe in the things that you are apparently standing for and speaking out on behalf of. Simple, point blank, period. Not that hard. Now, with that said, thank y'all so much for tuning into this week's show. I hope you guys enjoyed some of the throwback interviews we aired the last couple weeks. We'll be back with a completely brand new show next week. Until then, thank y'all so much for the support. I'll talk to you soon. Stay safe. Bye.